Today is the 20th day of July, 2023, and welcome again to the Chapter 49 podcast. My name is Larry Lannan. I'm a volunteer, a retiree. I help Chapter 49 out with some communications issues. We're very happy you've chosen to spend some of your valuable time with us today. And we also welcome Duncan Giles, our chapter president, back to the podcast. Welcome back, Duncan.
Thanks, Larry. It's always good to be here with you.
And I'm still kind of thinking about our last podcast. For those who weren't with us last week, we have been looking forward to this and been working on scheduling. Scheduling is always difficult when you're dealing with the national president of a union. And we finally got Tony Reardon to come on and do a final podcast with us. He's done several with us. And he's always been very generous with his time and getting with us and talking with us. And I thought it was really interesting, some of the things that he had to say. His plans, once he does retire, once he walks out of that convention floor in August, he will be done with that job. And he does have some plans to move to North Carolina. I think he'll be close to his daughter who's in college. And of all things, wants to be a play-by-play sports announcer, which I gave him some advice on. I think he's done a little bit of it, but I had my baptism of fire when I did that. And it was a long time ago, 1970, I think it was, when I had my baptism of fire and failed miserably in my first play-by-play effort, and then figured out, okay, and there's another way to do this. I better do it right this time. But he's got some great plans. He should be proud of the work that he's done. And I think the one thing that struck me, Duncan, is that during his time as the national president, obviously you have disputes. There's some people, you're going to make decisions that some people are going to take issue with. But I think he was very moved by the fact that you really, after all this and the times the two of you have worked together on a number of issues, that, you considered him to be a friend. And that seemed to be very important to him.
I think it's important to both of us. I've known Tony for a very, very long time, back before he was president or even vice president of NTEU, when he was the operations manager. And we became close then. And he is just overall a great guy. I mean, he really is. His whole family is great. Had conversations with his dad. His wife Dawn is a fantastic lady, great kids. He's just a wonderful guy, big sports fan. So him wanting to go into sportscasting does not surprise me in the least. And it's going to be very. I'm very happy for Tony to be able to go out the way he wants to go out, but it's absolutely bittersweet for me that I'm not going to be able to, email my friend regularly or contact him if something goes up or give him a heads up or just have a conversation about football.
Well, yeah, and I think he kind of misses following sports. When you're national president, you're traveling a lot, you have a tremendous workload and a lot of pressure on you. And I think I'm going to look forward to following sports more closely than he had in the past. And I understand how that is. So we wish him well. We're very, very happy and honored that he chose to join us for that podcast last week. And we'll begin the new era in August of a new national president. We'll hopefully get a chance to talk to her once she's officially takes the job and gets her feet on the ground in that job.
I bet you will be able to do that.
we've had her on as the national vice president, executive vice president, and she was very kind to give us time there. And she's a great guest. I love the way she banters. She has a great she has a great way of communicating. Let's put it that way. Well, speaking of communicating, it's what our job is here on this podcast. We have several issues to discuss. I want to start off with something we don't talk about much. I went back, 3 years ago or so when we started this podcast. All we talked about was COVID, because COVID was at its height. And we were the government was dealing with it, IRS was dealing with it, the whole society was dealing with COVID. And it was a tough situation to deal with. We all know that. But what I would like to ask you about is something that's recently officially happened and what the ramifications will be. This has to do with the old requirement that I understand it is no longer there, for COVID vaccinations. That rule's been rescinded, but there are some issues that are going to be related to that. So tell me how that's all coming out, if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, the executive order on, making sure that federal employees in the executive branch got COVID vaccination has been lifted. So what does that mean? Well, first off, if you are coming into the federal government, you are not required to get a COVID vaccination. Me being me, I think it's a good idea for folks to get things like COVID and flu vaccinations, but that's just me. I like, common sense type things, but you're not required to. Now, the thing that I think is going to be interesting in the coming weeks and months, if not sooner, is going to be now that the COVID emergency, as they called it, the legal emergency is over. There are an awful lot of people out there on reasonable accommodations due to COVID. They couldn't come into the office at all due to COVID. And now, are they going to be called back in full time or to the extent of their regular telework agreement based on this emergency now being over? I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with that.
So do we know as a union what's likely to happen on that?
Okay, so you're asking for logic and advanced planning. Is that what being shared with us? Is that what you're asking, Larry? How silly of you. No, they haven't told us squat. And the reason, to be honest with you, that I think they haven't told National and TU anything is the fact that IRS doesn't know yet how they want to handle it. They realize that they are going to have to deal with this. They've got this issue. It's, COVID as a national emergency is over. So now how do you deal with the fallout from this and start to get back to whatever normal is? And so I think until they've come up with a definite plan, they can't share that with NTEU.
So how does NTEU feel that it should be handled?
Properly, equitably. I mean, there are going to be still people with reasonable accommodation issues, be it COVID related or not COVID related, and those are going to have to be worked. But if it's something that said, okay, I can't come in due to my immune system because I may get COVID, that's going to be an issue that's going to, have to be resolved. And it might involve more documentation. I think the folks that deal with reasonable accommodations are going to have to take a close look at basically almost all, if not all, of the ones they have, or ask that they be resubmitted to for reasonable accommodation based on the fact that there is no more COVID emergency. So I think that there are a lot of moving parts to this that the IRS hasn't gotten a handle on yet.
I think I've mentioned before that I do some podcasts and the news reporting in my local community as a volunteer blogger and podcaster. And I interviewed our public health director for Fishers, Indiana, just the other day. And she indicated that there will be COVID and flu vaccines available in the fall. And that, there's a national decision as to what needs to go into that, what variants of COVID will be attacked in that vaccine, and the flu. There are various types of flu. What types of flu are going to be in that vaccine? So that's all being done now. And so for those of you who do want vaccines, as I understand it, they should be available in the fall. September, October is the most likely time. So just so if you want to plan ahead, you can do that. Are you still able to get some time off for vaccines in the contract?
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that when we sat down with them in person in DC a few years ago, we hammered this out, actually 2 years ago this summer. We hammered this particular thing out because we wanted to make sure that if the COVID became like a flu, that we were able to get time for employees to go ahead and get those shots, just like they're able to get flu shots, time to get flu shots. So yeah, that is still in the contract and still is going to be it. I give a lot of credit to our former VP, Jim Bailey, Ken Moffitt, and our current national VP, Doreen Greenwald, who are the spearhead of our negotiations teams. And I'll even give Lori McCann and the other chapter presidents a lot of credit for making sure that this gets done, because this is something that's very important to us. Is public health and employees' health is, at the forefront of NTU. We want to make sure that everybody is as healthy as they can be, and so we wanted to make sure that this was still in the contract. If it became, as it has now, something that's going to be seasonal, like the regular influenza shot.
Duncan, you just mentioned telework, and you worked hard on the telework provisions in the new contract. We still, as a union, have negotiated a contract with the IRS and NTEU as to how telework is going to be handled. Now, if you're watching the news or following the news, you're hearing a lot from Congress, certain members of Congress, not all by any means, wanting people to get back into the office and no longer, someone say, don't even work at home at all. You are to work in the office every day. You're hearing rhetoric like that. But explain it. Let's talk about IRS here. The other agencies have contracts as well with NTEU and other unions. But we have at NTEU a contract with IRS. And the most recent contract that you negotiated with your team calls for an expansion of telework as far as the number of positions that are covered by it. So when you hear this rhetoric about everybody in the federal employment world is supposed to go back to the office every day, that's not necessarily true. Explain how that works.
Yeah, this is one of those things where you have to look beyond the headlines or the sound bites. And what it amounts to, the IRS and NTEU signed a national agreement that includes telework. And that is what those provisions are going to be, what's going to be ruling. Now, if Congress wants to make a change and, pass laws, pass the House, pass the Senate, be signed by the president, then it's a different matter. But until then, and I don't anticipate that happening, we're still going to be under the same telework provisions that we have been. If you're a frequent teleworker, you're supposed to be in twice a pay period unless you're a mobile teleworker working in, the zip code type thing. So, or excuse me, the commuting area. So there's no change for IRS employees. And I'm on a few message boards, for lack of a better term, on certain sites that deal with federal employees and federal employee issues. And there are an awful lot of agencies out there that are calling employees back because they don't have those agreements. And those folks are not happy. And again, I get why they want to do that, especially in downtown DC. The businesses are suffering. They're not having the offices filled like they should, so they're paying for empty space. I get all that. But for IRS, and again, I'm speaking just for IRS because I'm very familiar with our contract, there is no change for us. So unless there's a federal law passed and signed by the president, we're still going to remain the status quo the same way we are now.
And it should be noted, IRS has a long history with this. It was the mid-90s when we, as a union, negotiated what was then called FlexiPlace, because technology had not advanced that much at the time. And at that particular point in time, it was mostly for people working in the field, so they could, work at home some of the time, but other employees also were able to use it. Just take your work home with you. Well, once technology advanced and we have telework where you can work at home and hooked into the office by computer, there are still agencies out there. And I think this is where a lot of this comes in. I just read an article the other day about how a lot of agencies have never budgeted for this. They just don't understand the concept of working at home in a telework situation. I think one advantage IRS and NTEU have is we've been dealing with this general issue since the mid-1990s.
Absolutely. So we, as you said, we have a great familiarity with it. And there's an awful lot of management in government that, I want to see my people. I want to be there. I want to, have these water cooler discussions and all that. That hasn't happened in the IRS in a very long time. We've got a lot of remote management, so it doesn't really make sense for us. Whereas, if you've got a bunch of people that are in an office that don't do field work and have their manager right there, perhaps I could see that. But that doesn't usually happen, and it's not the way that the IRS has been building out and will continue probably to build out that way. So I give a great deal of credit to Commissioner Werfel, and of course to National President Reardon and National VP Doreen Greenwald for making sure that we're not getting sucked into any of this noise, and everybody realizes it's situation normal here for the IRS.
And one last thing on telework. If you have a situation, because there has been an expansion as far as the number of positions covered by telework as a result of the contract that you and your team negotiated recently, if you have an employee that's having difficulty getting their telework scheduled within the provisions of the contract, and the manager doesn't seem to be willing to work with the employee on working at home some of the time, well, what do you do as an employee?
In that case, you're going to have to talk to wherever your union is. If you're in Indiana, it would be contact a steward or officer of Chapter 49. If you're outside of Indiana, you contact your local NTU chapter so they can sit there and have a discussion with the manager. First off, we're going to take a look to make sure that you do qualify, that your position is one that can telework, that your work is such that you are at least fully successful, that you haven't had, particular disciplinary issues in the recent past that would perhaps bar you from telework. But aside from that, you should be, if you do qualify, there shouldn't, and there aren't those impediments, then you should be allowed to telework. And if you've got some old time managers who, I want my employees here in the office, I don't care what the contract says, well, that's where we come in and have those discussions informally or formally, however it needs to take place, to make sure that the employees are getting what their contractual rights are.
Okay, so good advice there. Let me ask about this. I've said this before, I'll say it again. There's so many people in the United States Congress who are adamant about making sure laws are observed and enforced, unless, of course, it's a tax law. So once again, we see the House Appropriations Committee has voted out a bill that would slash $1 billion, that's with a B, $1 billion out of enforcement. And, it's sorely needed, yet that's still the case. Now, it's not the last word on this. It's just not the opening salvo, but it's discouraging to see this be the start of the process.
Yeah, this goes back to that trope that certain political folks have been trotting out with the 87,000 jackbooted agents with the Inflation Reduction Act that we were going to get and things of that nature. And it's all just malarkey. It's just not true. And when you start cutting things like this, as Tony said last week, the IRS provides over 95% of the money coming into the United States Treasury. And so you want to cut the enforcement part of that so you're not bringing in as much. I don't know any successful model of business or private government or government situations that could thrive on that type of thinking. It's just totally, as my late mother used to say, bass backwards. So you want to make sure that you have that type of, those folks out there that are collecting what's owed, that are going out and auditing the folks. And we're not talking, and again, as the president made clear when, he was proposing the Inflation Reduction Act, these are for taxpayers making over $400,000. So we're not talking about going after folks who are lower income. We're talking about folks who've made a good income, who owe taxes, and for whatever reason, either aren't paying them or perhaps are trying to come up with some creative ways not to pay taxes. So we need the folks that are tax compliance officers and our revenue agents to go out there and make sure that they're paying their fair share.
Yeah, bass backwards. Are we allowed to say that on a podcast?
I think I just slipped it in. I was
gonna say, if
my
it's
late
your
mom's looking down at me and laughing.
Yeah. Well, if your mother said it, okay, then it's okay. All right, that's the we'll say that's all right. There's a I want to talk about something else in this podcast, because I've said this before and I'll say it again. My very first job at IRS in 1983 was a supply clerk, about as low as you can get. I think it was a grade 3. I couldn't even do time cards because I wasn't a 4. And then became a control clerk and took courses at night in college level courses, and was able to qualify for promotions on down the line to tax law specialist and even manager later on. So I'm a believer that support staff is great to have, and sometimes that can be a stepping stone to doing something better for an employee. So we've seen a reduction, at least I did, and I think you still do at the IRS. There's been a reduction in the support staff. Technology has had something to do with that, but we're seeing an increase in support staff hiring in SBSE, where a lot of compliance work is done, and that is an encouraging sign, Duncan.
It certainly is. I was so glad to see those figures that they have done some hiring and are going to continue to do hiring. And I would hope that the rest of the divisions of the IRS would follow suit, because, and I'll tell you what, from Commissioner Charles Rosati on up, every commissioner I've talked to about this issue, that, we need to hire folks on the phone. We need to hire folks in TAS. We need to hire folks in compliance in LB&I. Absolutely, we need to hire those. But with those, if you're not hiring the clericals, the support staff, the IT folks to take care of it, it's just going to topple over. It's not going to be able to get the work done that we need to do. And, I'm going to credit again the current commissioner, and I'll give some credit to Commissioner Reddick as well, that they started to understand that and started the ball rolling on this type of hiring. So the more support staff that we have, and it's evolved over the years how they did, like you said, they're not doing time as much anymore, but there's a lot of other things that they need to do that they can do, especially in places like SBSE, LB&I, W&I. And I would hope that they would continue to add more and more support staff to that to make everyone's jobs easier.
Yeah, and I'm a big believer in support staff, and it really does help the professionals, the people doing the core work, the time and the ability to focus in on that work. And yes, we may have the technology that allows people to do some of those clerical types of things. That doesn't mean it's a good idea to do it. So great comment. Last thing I want to talk about today, maybe we'll do a little more of this. I think there are parts of our contract with the IRS. Some of these provisions have been in there for a very long time, but we tend not to focus on them. I think one of the great provisions in the NTU IRS contract that's been there for a long time is the ability of employees, when the assessment period comes up, to write their own self-assessment, submit it to the manager, and have that as part of the consideration of the annual appraisal. Now, I think a lot of people don't do that, and probably should. How to, Duncan, just give people an overview of how to do it and why you should do it.
Yeah, that's a great point, Larry. Nobody knows the work you're doing, including your manager, better than you do. Nobody knows that. And, people like, well, I don't like to toot my own horn, or I don't like this. The way to make sure that you're getting the evaluation that you deserve is to do a self-assessment. You have time on the clock to do it. There are tutorials out there on how to do it. And, if you're sitting there talking about the successes you've had over the year in how you're doing things properly, how you're following the critical job elements and things of that nature, you absolutely want to point those out to your manager. Not only will it make it better for you, but it's also easier on the manager to do your appraisal, because I know there are a lot of managers who will go take a look at a self-assessment that's submitted the last month of your rating period, and they'll say, okay, this is making my job a lot easier, so they incorporate a lot of that into your appraisal. So yeah, I would absolutely urge everyone to take the time to do a self-assessment. It's very important for you to do, and it's only going to help you.
Yeah, and if you feel that you need help or you want some assistance or online help. There's online help available, and you can always contact your own local steward. They'll be glad to help you with that if you feel uncomfortable doing it yourself. And hey, your manager doesn't know everything you do, and you need to kind of remind them. Manager will document a lot if they're a good manager, but that doesn't mean they document everything you've done. So you have to remind that manager of that, and that's a good thing to bring up at evaluation time. And it's in the contract as to the window as to when you should write the self-assessment. It's a certain amount of time before your appraisal is due. Okay, Duncan, your final comment for this podcast.
Yeah, mine is, again, I want to go back to that's something I've hit on a lot, but I love to remind people this. What you're doing here, the work that you're doing, is extremely important. And I am proud to be associated with each and every one of you, because employees here at the IRS do a great job. But this is not your life. This is your work. Your life is your family, your friends, things of that nature. Do not let the job totally absorb you. I've seen this happen, and I don't want it to happen to anyone else, because at the end of the day, as the phrase goes, it's not going to be how many hours you put in at work or how you did this or all that. It's how you lived your life with your family, with your friends, with your fellow human beings that's going to be important. And I've fallen into this trap myself, because I used to be absorbed by the job. But now I spend a lot more time with my wonderful partner Kim, my great daughter and son-in-law Maddie and Travis. And those are the most rewarding things. And I've got an extremely rewarding job that I love doing and appreciate very much. But again, it's work, it's not life.
Well, Duncan, I will plead guilty. I am totally absorbed in being retired. So I've allowed that to completely envelop my life. Now, my final comment is this, and it has to do with something that Commissioner Werfel said at a hearing recently. In fact, by the way, just as a reminder, Commissioner Werfel still open the invitation. He's welcome to come on this podcast anytime. But it kind of goes back to the enforcement and some of the other things we've talked about today. Somebody, I can't believe this happened, somebody on one of these committees asked Commissioner Werfel, how much does your agency spend on ammunition? And his response was, well, I have to get back to you on that, but not very much. I think about the only time our CI agents use their ammunition is in target practice. I can't remember the last time a CI agent for IRS ever used their gun in line of duty. I can't even remember an example of that. It probably happens, but not very often. So
yeah, it's very rare. So that's a great example of a question that shouldn't be asked.
that was a good answer the commissioner gave, by the way.
Yep.
Well, Duncan, thank you very much. Always great to talk to you. This is the Chapter 49 podcast. We do these as weekly as we can. And we appreciate the fact, again, as I said earlier, that you have taken some of your time out of your busy day to listen or watch this podcast. And we try to do it weekly. We don't get every week in. July 4th weekend, we weren't there. And I think Duncan's got a convention coming up in August, and we may not be recording that week because we'll both be busy with different things that week. But it's been an honor to do this podcast. It's been 3 years plus we've been doing it. I don't know, Duncan. It's just like things. Time goes by quickly when you're having such a good time. So, with that in mind, we thank you again for watching and listening. Please be safe and be kind.